Hello viewers, welcome to K Diagnostics, Dio here. Today we have a 2000 Dodge Ram 3500 with a 5.9 diesel. The complaint on this truck is that the ABS light remains on while the engine is running. So the ABS system is basically inoperative because while the vehicle is being driven, the ABS light remains on the dash. And when your ABS light is on the dash, it means there's something wrong within the ABS system. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to confirm the customer's complaint. After confirming the customer's complaint, we're going to connect a scan tool to the truck to see what kind of trouble codes we have in memory. So I'm going to start the truck and then I'll bring you guys over here on the instrument cluster so that we can confirm the customer's complaint. So now let's confirm the customer's complaint. Alright, so we're going to start the truck. As you can see, the truck is running. The ABS light went off and then it came back on. So right there. So the customer is concerned about this light, the ABS light. The airbag light is also on, but on this video we're just gonna focus on the ABS light. So this is what we're gonna fix in this video. So as you can see, the ABS light remains on. So when you first start the truck, the ABS system, there's a system check that occurs within the system. That's why the light went off momentarily. And then it came back on because there is a fault in the system. And as you can see right now, the light remained on. So there's a problem in the ABS system. So customer's complaint confirmed. So now I'm gonna connect the scan tool to the truck so we can see what's causing this ABS light to remain on. I will get the scan tool connected and then I'll bring you guys back up. So the scan tool has been connected to the truck. So now let's scan it for some trouble codes. Let's go to anti-lock brakes. So we're gonna click on the anti-lock brakes tab. So this is a four-wheel ABS. It has two sensors in the front, one on the left front wheel and the other one on the right front wheel. And then the third one is on the differential, above the differential housing. So we're gonna click on the four-wheel ABS tab. So let's go to codes. And we're now communicating with the ABS control module. And as you can see, it says no communication is key on, ensure scanner is connected. Yes, the scanner is connected. I can see my dangle light here. So the dangle light is on. So my scan tool is definitely connected. And as you can see right there, our key is still on. So apparently we cannot communicate with the ABS control module. So let's back out of here and try to communicate with another module. Let's back out of the ABS control module. And remember, we also had the airbag light that was on. So let's try to communicate with the airbag control module to see what kind of trouble codes we have on the airbag control module. So let's click on airbag. So now we're gonna try to read the codes in the airbag control module. So let's click on codes. And as you can see, we are able to communicate with the airbag control module. And we have one trouble code in the airbag control module. And it says driver square circuit, okay? So we are able to communicate with the airbag module, but we can't communicate with the ABS control module. Let's back out of here. And let's try to communicate one more time with the ABS control module. So let's click on anti-lock brakes once again. Four-wheel ABS. Codes. So as you can see, we still can't communicate with this module. Now let's try to read the data. Same thing. We don't have communication with the ABS control module. So now, what do you do when you cannot communicate with the module? Well, so when I have a module that does not communicate with the scan tool, my next step is usually checking my powers and grounds at the module. Okay, so now I'm gonna bring up our wiring diagram so we can familiarize ourselves with the wiring diagram, with how this module is wired. So we're gonna pay attention to the power supply wires and the ground wires. So we're going to check our powers and grounds at the module first. And then if the powers and grounds check out okay, then we will look at some communication waveforms with the lab scope. But let's look at the wiring diagram first. So I'm going to click on the Show Track and Repair Information tab. So it looks like it's just a one-page wiring diagram. It looks like there are 3 fuses that supply power to our ABS control module. There's fuse 3, fuse 14, and fuse 11. These are in the junction box here inside the car, and these ones here are in the power distribution box under the hood. So let's keep scrolling down. So here are our ABS sensors. So it's got 3 sensors, and then here is our ABS control module. And as you can see on the module itself, it says controller anti-lock brake, and it says 4-wheel ABS engine compartment mounted on hydraulic control unit. So this ABS control unit is just right there under the hood, and it's pretty accessible and it's pretty easy to get to. So what you could start with, we can either start with checking these fuses. Maybe we have a blown fuse. We can go to the fuses and check the fuses first. But since this ABS control unit is really easy to access, I'm just going to go straight to the ABS control unit itself. And it only has 2 connectors. There's C1 and C2, and these connectors don't have a lot of wires. And as you can see on our wiring diagram here, it shows that this ABS control unit has 1 ground supply wire, so wire 6. So there's a ground here and there's another ground, wire 13. So this ABS control module has 2 ground wires and 2 positive or 12 volt supply wires, so the one that says battery. So this here should have a 12 volt all the time, so pin 14 and pin 7. So 2 ground wires, 2 12 volt supply wires coming from the battery or fuse somewhere. And then there's another one that says ignition, wire 4. So pin 4 says ignition. So on pin 4 we should have power with the key on. So now let's go under the hood, and since this control module is really easy to access, we can do our checks there. So let's go check our powers and grounds at the module under the hood. Alright guys, so we are here under the hood, and our ABS control unit lives over here. And this is so easy to get to, and the electrical connectors are right on top here. So it doesn't get any better. So checking the powers and grounds at the ABS control module will be a lot easier. So right here is the ABS control unit, and down here is the hydraulic pump. So what we need to do is we have to check our powers and grounds here. Remember, we cannot communicate with the scan tool. So the scan tool cannot talk to this ABS control unit. We have to make sure that this unit is getting powers and grounds. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get a test light, and then we will check our powers and grounds here at the ABS control unit. Alright, so now we're going to check our powers and grounds at the ABS control module. So I have my test light connected to battery ground right now. We're going to test our test light first. So when I touch positive, our test light lights. Okay. So now what we need to do is we have to find our positive wires, or our power supply wires to our ABS control module. So this big wire here, I think this red wire with a green tracer, this is a power supply to the ABS control module. We can double check on the wiring diagram. So here is the wiring diagram, and we are checking pin 7, the one that says battery. So it is a red wire with a dark green, so red with a dark green tracer, and it definitely looks like the one we have here. So dark green, and don't know if you can see the tracer, but it's definitely this one, dark green. And no, it's a red wire with a dark green tracer. So I'm gonna back probe this. Okay, so let's back probe this one. I have my test light connected to ground. once I touch this back probing tool, if we have power or if we have 12 volts on that wire, my test light should light. So right there, as you can see, my test light is lit. Okay, so once I touch that, my test light lights. So we have power on pin 7. So right there, we have tested pin 7. Okay, so we made sure that there's power on pin 7. So now we're gonna test pin 14. Pin 14 also is a power supply wire, and this should have power all the time. Whether the key is on or not, we should have power here. So we checked 7, so now let's check pin 14, and it is a red wire with a dark green tracer. So same thing like the one we just checked. And it looks like it's the wire just underneath it. Okay, so this one and then the one below it. So right there. So now we're gonna test the second one. My test light is still connected to battery ground, so once I touch this, my test light should light. And as you can see, my test light is lit. So, or I can do it this way. So right here, my test light is lit. So both power supply wires to the ABS control module are good. Okay, so we checked pin 7 and pin 14. So 7 and 14 are good. So now we're gonna check pin 4, which is a red wire with a dark blue tracer. So we're gonna check this wire right over here. Red wire with a dark blue tracer, pin 4. And this is a power that gets supplied to the ABS control module with the key on. So when you turn the key on, we should have power here on this wire. So now we're gonna back probe this wire. And this wire is this guy over here. Okay, so we're gonna back probe. So it's this wire right here, the ignition power wire. So that wire gets power when the key is on. So I just back probed it. My test light is still connected to battery ground. So right there, as you can see, we definitely have power on the ignition wire, okay? Pin 4. So right there, we do have power on pin 4. So our power supply wires have checked out okay. So now we're gonna check our ground supply wire. So what I need to do now is I'm gonna switch my test light to battery positive, since we're gonna be testing our ground wires now. So as we look here on the wiring diagram, so our ground wires are pin 6 and pin 13. So we have two ground wires on this ABS control module. So 6 and 13. So pin 6 ground, black wire with a violet tracer. So now we're gonna back probe that wire. It's this wire right over here. I wish all the modules were kind of easy to get to, or the wires on the modules were kind of easy to access. I mean, if all the modules were just this easy, that would have made my job a lot easier and a lot better sometimes. So, and as I'm looking at this electrical connector, the power wires and the ground supply wires are slightly heavy gauge. They're heavier, they're bigger wires than the other ones. So they're heavy gauge wires compared to the other ones. So the ground wire is this one, black wire with a violet tracer. So I'm gonna back probe this one now. Okay, and my test light is still connected to battery positive. So if there's ground on that ground supply wire, my test light should light. So we're gonna attach the back of the back probing tool. And as you can see, my test light is lit. So we have ground on pin 4. So the first ground wire is good. So now let's check the second ground wire. So the second ground wire is pin 14. Okay, so pin 14 is this wire down over here. So pin 14 is just below the wire we just checked. Okay, I hope you can see that. So the wire below the first ground wire. So that's pin 14. Okay, test light still connected to battery positive. Now I'm going to attach the back of the back probing tool. If my test light lights, it means the second ground wire has ground on it. So let me make sure I'm making good connection here. Alright, so I think I'm making good connection now. My test light is still connected to battery positive. And as you can see, my test light is lit. So I just wasn't making good connection. So we definitely have ground on the second ground supply wire. Alright, so with these tests, we have confirmed that our ABS control module is receiving power and ground. So our power supply and ground supply wires are good. Now let's try one more time with our scan tool to see if we can communicate with it. If we still can't communicate with it, now what are we gonna do? So let's go. Our key is still on and we are still here. The scan tool is still connected. So let's go to anti-lock brakes, 4-wheel ABS. Let's go to codes. So let's see what it's gonna say. And as you can see, we still can't communicate with the ABS control module. So now the other problem might be pin fitment. You know, if some of these pins are not fitting very well, you know, if we have pins that are not touching the terminals in the connector. So let me try to, I'm gonna disconnect this connector so we can check our pins. So I disconnected the ABS electrical connector and our pins actually look really good. So we can do a drag test just to see if our connectors there are feeling very well. So I can feel a drag. We don't have terminals that are spread open. So we don't have a pin fitment issue. So this is starting to lead me towards a defective ABS control module. So now the next step I want to do is I want to look at the communication waveform, okay? Because this ABS control module communicates in the CAN bus system with the other modules, okay? So now we need to find out what are the communication lines here on the connector. I'm gonna back probe the two communication wires. Then we will look at the waveform. We'll see what kind of communication waveform we're gonna see from this ABS control module. So let's back out of here. We're still gonna use our scan tool here. So let's go back to our ABS control module wiring diagram. Now we're gonna find two wires on the ABS control module that say something about the CAN bus. Alright, so right here we see CCD bus positive, and this is pin 3. And then the second one is CCD bus negative, and it's pin 10. So right over here. So we're gonna back probe pin 3, which is a violet wire with a brown tracer. And then we're also gonna back probe pin 10, which is a white wire with a black tracer. So these two wires here should be our communication lines. So these two wires will show us the waveform of the CAN bus system. So I'm going to back probe these two wires, and then I will get the lab scope test leads out, and then I'll bring you guys back up so we can look at the communication waveform. Alright, so I brought out the lab scope test leads, and I back probed the communication wires on the ABS control module. So now what we need to do is we have to look at the waveform on the lab scope. So just to show you the wiring diagram one more time. So I back probed pin 3, which is CCD bus positive. So pin number 3, and also pin 10, CCD bus negative. So right now we're gonna look at the communication waveform of this CAN bus system. So let's back out of here and go to our scope multimeter. So let's go to scope multimeter. So we're gonna turn on our channels here, and we need to be on the voltage scale. So we're gonna turn channel 2 and channel 1 on. So now, as you can see, we're already seeing something on the screen, but this doesn't look like a good communication pattern, okay? So we're gonna drop down our voltages here. Let's drop down to 5 volts. So it's starting to look like a communication waveform. So let's drop down our time base. Let's go down to 50 milliseconds. So now it's starting to look like a communication waveform. So let's trigger this. I don't like what I'm seeing here. Do you see this? This doesn't look like a good communication pattern. I don't like what I'm seeing here. So let's look at our D0 numbers. So live, we are reading between 1 and 2 volts on the first channel on the yellow trace, and then on the second channel, the green trace, we're reading 2 volts. And both of them are just going from low to high. These two waveforms actually, CAN high should go from low to high, and then CAN low should go from high to low. So basically from 0.5 volt to 2 volts or 3 volts, and then the other one should go from 3 volts down to 0.5. Okay, so something is wrong here. So you see how both of these lines are both going up? One of them should be going down. So now we could have a defective ABS control module causing this. So now what I'm going to do is, with the lab scope being connected, I'm going to disconnect the ABS control module, and then we're going to look at our pattern and see if it's going to change, because we shouldn't see these spikes here on the screen. The waveform should look nice and consistent across the screen. The spikes you are seeing here, this is abnormal, and I believe this is a problem. We shouldn't have this, okay? And we can have a defective module causing this. Since our ABS control module is not communicating, I'm going to start by disconnecting this ABS control module first. We have determined that it has power and grounds, and it's still not communicating. And the waveform we're seeing is not a good one. So I'm going to disconnect the ABS control module. So I'm going to try to get the lab scope in a shot too. So I'm going to disconnect this. So I did disconnect the electrical connector of the ABS control module. And as you can see, with the ABS control module disconnected, we have a nice and clean pattern on the lab scope. And once I reconnect the ABS control module, there's a big spike that's gonna be shown on the screen. As you can see, we have a big spike there on the screen, and this is abnormal, guys. This is a problem. So once I disconnect the ABS control module, that spike is gonna disappear. Watch that spike of voltage disappear as I disconnect this. So it's connected. I'm gonna disconnect this now. It's gonna disappear on the screen. So right there. So this is definitely caused, that big spike is being caused by this ABS control module. So this is why this ABS control module is not communicating with the scan tool. I'm gonna leave it right over here. At this point, I feel comfortable replacing the ABS control module. We're gonna go ahead and get a ABS control unit from the junkyard. And then once we get an ABS control unit from the junkyard, then we'll bring everybody back up so we can double check and confirm our repair. But actually, before we do that, we have to test the ABS sensors. Okay. Because I want to test the sensors because, I mean, we know there's one problem with the control module. The module is not talking with the scanner, so that's one thing we already figured out.
Right.
But the thing is, if there's one sensor that's not communicating, or one bad sensor, after replacing the ABS control module, the light will still remain on.
Yeah.
And the owner might say, well, did you guys even fix my car? You know, so the light is still on. So now what we need to do is we have to test the sensors and make sure that all ABS sensors are working.
Right.
So now what we need to do is we're going to look at the wiring diagram again. Here are the sensors. These here are the ABS sensors. So this is the rear one. It says rear wheel speed sensor, and this one is the left front wheel speed sensor. I hope you guys can see. So let's start with the left front. So these two wires, the red wire and the red and gray wire, they both go back to this connector.
Which is this connector here.
Yes, which is that connector, but I think it's the other one because if you look closely here on the wiring diagram, we have two connectors, right?
Yeah.
So here it says C2,
Oh, yeah.
which has C2 means connector 2, and connector 2 has 4 wires. And as you see up there, we have another connector that has 4 wires. So we're gonna back probe these 2 red wires on the other connector. So we're gonna back probe wire number 1 and number 2. Okay, so these 2 red wires over here. So we're gonna back probe these 2 red wires. So these 2 red wires are coming from the left front wheel speed sensor. Now what we need to do is we're just gonna use one channel. So basically we're back probing pin 1 and 2 on the second connector. So this connector right here, and we are doing this just to test the ABS sensors. So this is gonna go over here. Okay, and then, so when you test an ABS sensor, since these are inductive type ABS sensors, they produce a signal. So we have to make sure that the ground lead and the positive lead on the channel is connected to both wires coming from the sensor. So what we're gonna do is I have my yellow lead going to one wire, one red wire, and then the black lead will go to the other wire. So this is gonna go over here.
It's like a surgeon.
Kinda, yeah. A surgeon for cars.
Yeah.
All right, so now let's go to our lab scope and look at the voltage waveform, or the voltage that this sensor is gonna put out, because these ABS sensors, when the wheel spins, they make a voltage. So we're just gonna look at, we're just gonna look at the first channel. Let's turn off the trigger. Let's go down to maybe 2 volts. So we did put the truck on the lift. So Ivan is gonna lift the truck off the ground, and then we're gonna spin. We're gonna start with the left front wheel. Once we spin it, this sensor, if the sensor is good, we should see a voltage signal on the lab scope. So let's raise up the truck from the ground so we can spin the tire. All right. So I think the wheel is off the ground. Oh, no, not yet. Go a little bit more. Yeah, that's good. So now, can you spin that tire? Okay, now hold on. So I'm starting to see, as you're spinning this, I'm gonna hold this way so we can see. Hopefully this doesn't fall. Okay, so spin it. Okay, so I see a movement here. You probably won't be able to see, Ivan, but I see. Can you see that line move?
Oh, yeah.
So now what I need to do, I just have to increase my time base so we can see more detail. Okay, so right there, spin. Do you see that signal right there? So Ivan is spinning the tire. See that? Okay, that's good. So this left front sensor is definitely producing a signal. Spin it one more time. Okay, that's good. I feel comfortable with this. So the left front sensor is good. So now we're gonna test the right front sensor. So now let's back out of here and go back to our wiring diagram. So we checked the left front sensor. So now we're gonna check the right front. And the right front is actually the other 2 wires. So so as you can see here on this connector, Ivan, so the second connector, the first 2 red wires are the wires coming from the left front sensor. And then the other wires, I think, so yeah, so the other 2 wires on this connector are the wires coming from the right front ABS sensor. So now we're gonna back probe these other 2 wires. So the other 2 wires should be, so can you shine the light here? So the other wires should be this one Let me see. So this one over here, and then that one. All right, so these two. So we just back probed these other two wires. So we're good. So we just back probed back to the wiring diagram. So we back probed these last two wires on the connector. So now let's go back to our lab scope, and now we're gonna spin the right front wire and see if it's gonna produce any type of signal. So Ivan will be spinning the wheel. So Ivan is spinning the right front wheel right now, and as you can see, the sensor is definitely producing a signal, but it's a very weak signal. It's barely going above half a volt. So that's good. Yeah, so this is, we either have a weak sensor on the right front wheel, or maybe the gap between the sensor and the reluctor wheel is too big. So now let's just compare it to the right front. I mean, you guys saw the signal that sensor is producing. So now I'm gonna swap the wires one more time. Let's go back to the wires on the left front wheel speed. So now we're gonna look at the signal coming from the left front wheel speed sensor. Okay, Ivan, can you spin this wheel? Let's see the difference. You see how high this signal is? This is what we should see on both wheels. So this signal here looks good to me. It looks like the sensor is good, and the gap between the reluctor wheel and the sensor is good. Okay, all right, Ivan. So basically what we need to do, I mean, we're still gonna replace the ABS control unit, but we have to adjust the gap back there.
Okay.
We either have to adjust the gap. After adjusting the gap, if it doesn't fix it, then we're gonna have to replace the sensor.
Okay.
Okay, so that's one thing to know, because even if we just replace the ABS control module, and we don't adjust that, the light will still be on.
Okay.
So now we're gonna test the last sensor, which is the sensor above the differential.
Okay.
So what we need to do now is we're gonna do the same thing like we're doing on the other sensors. We're gonna back probe the wires coming from that sensor. So we need to find those wires on the wiring diagram. So the rear wheel speed sensor wires are right here. So they are on the big connector. So it's pin 8 and pin 1. So now we're gonna test this sensor, this rear wheel speed sensor. And the wires coming from this sensor is this wire, the first wire right here, the red wire, this one, so red and violet, and then the second one, the second one is this one over here, and then the second one is the wire that just highlighted. So these two wires. So this is the first wire coming from the rear wheel speed sensor, and this is the second one. So we're gonna back probe pin 1 on the big connector, so C1, and then pin 8. So now we're gonna back probe this on the connector here. So I think pin 1 is this one over here. So pin 1 should be, so that's pin 1 right there. And then, where is the other one? Pin 8. Okay, so now we just back probed pin 1 and 8. So we can either connect it or not. So also, the good thing about this test is that it's telling us the integrity of the wiring from the sensor all the way up to the ABS control module. Because as we're spinning the tires, if we see a signal here, it means the wiring from the sensor all the way up to the ABS control module is good. So we already tested the integrity of the wiring from both sides up here in the front. So now we're gonna test the sensor and the wiring integrity from the differential up to the ABS control module. So what we need to do now is we have to raise up the rear wheels. So let's raise up the rear wheels, and then we're gonna put the vehicle in neutral, then we're gonna spin the drive shaft. Once we spin the drive shaft, we should see a signal here on the lab scope. So Ivan is gonna raise up the rear wheels now. All right, that's good. So now let's put the truck in neutral. All right, so now while Ivan is putting the truck in neutral, so we're gonna look at our lab scope. Let's go to scope multimeter. All right, so here's our lab scope. So Ivan, do you mind grabbing a creeper and crawling under the truck so you can spin the drive shaft? And as Ivan is spinning the drive shaft, it's gonna spin the ring gear on the differential, which will go past the sensor, and the sensor will make a signal. Can you grab a light and make sure there's a sensor above the differential? There's a sensor there. Is it connected? Because I don't see any signal here on the lab scope. Spin it. Nothing is happening on the lab scope. Let me make sure I'm back probing the right wires. Okay, so I'm gonna make sure we're back probing the right wires before Ivan continues to spin the drive shaft. All right, so I was back probing the right wires. I made sure that I back probed the right wires. The wires coming from the sensor on the differential. But what happened was, since this is a dually and it has a big ring gear, so Ivan wasn't spinning the drive shaft fast enough. You know, this is dead. This is it's got heavier tires and the ring gear is really big on the differential. So that's why there was no signal being generated here. So now what we're gonna do is Ivan is gonna drive the vehicle on the lift. So Ivan, let's start the vehicle, put it in drive, and the wheels will spin. Once the rear wheels spin, we will see a signal here on the lab scope. So let's start the truck. All right, so put it in drive. All right, so as you can see, it just stepped on the brakes. There's nothing. Step all the way. Okay. All right, so that's good. We tested all the sensors. So what we did was right here on the wiring diagram, I was back probing these two wires coming from the sensor, and while Ivan put the truck in gear, we were able to see a signal coming from this sensor. And like I said, these are inductive type ABS sensors. When the wheel or the reluctor wheel that's next to the tip of the sensor spins, this sensor produces a signal. Okay, so this tells us that all sensors are good, besides the right front sensor that wasn't generating a good signal. I mean, we're gonna have to check that. We will take the tires off to bleed the brakes anyways, because I did order a new ABS control module. So we have determined that this ABS control unit is defective. The scan tool can't talk to it, and this is what's causing the ABS light to remain on the dash. So we have to replace this ABS control unit. I said we were gonna replace it with a used unit from the junkyard. I talked to the customer. The customer said since he uses this truck for pushing snow, we're gonna get a unit that would last longer. So I said if that's the case, getting a new unit would be the best option. So I called the dealer. These units are obsolete. The dealer doesn't have these units anymore. So I called around. I found one from Auto ECMs in PA. They have some remanufactured units. So I did buy a unit from Auto ECMs. So it just came in. It's in that box over there. So now we're gonna replace this ABS control unit with a new one that we just received from Auto ECMs. So I'm gonna show you the new unit. So the new unit is right in this box. So let me get it out of the box so I can show it to you. So here it is. All right, so here is the new unit that we received from Auto ECMs, okay? So basically, we're gonna remove this old ABS unit and we will replace it by this one. And as you can see, the new one looks nice and shiny. It looks identical. So we're gonna install this ABS control unit on the truck, and this is a remanufactured one. So after we install this, we should be able to talk to it with a scan tool, and the ABS light should go off after that. I mean, the ABS light on the dash should go off, okay? So removing this is pretty straightforward. We have to disconnect all these brake lines. And after disconnecting the brake lines, we're gonna disconnect these electrical connectors. And then the whole unit has a mount. So you see that nut over there? We have to undo this nut. And then there's another bolt. I don't know if you can see that. So that 13mm bolt down there, we have to undo that one. And then there's another bolt back here. So that nut over there. So those 3 nuts. So basically, after we undo this nut over here, that one, and then another one over here, this whole unit is gonna come out with its mounting support. Okay, so we're gonna remove this, and we will install this new, this remanufactured ABS control unit. So I'm gonna seat you guys over here so we can get this ABS control unit replaced.